Moving into a new home is supposed to be an exciting, fulfilling experience. For me, it was the culmination of years of hard work and saving. After living in cramped apartments with noisy neighbors, thin walls, and limited privacy, I was eager to finally have a place I could truly call my own. The house I purchased was in a quiet, seemingly peaceful neighborhood, exactly the kind of place I had been searching for. With tree-lined streets and well-maintained lawns, it looked like the perfect place to settle down and enjoy some peace and quiet. I had spent months looking for the right property, carefully weighing my options and considering every little detail. The home I finally chose wasn't the biggest or the most extravagant, but it had charm, potential, and, most importantly, space. There was a decent-sized backyard where I could plant a garden, a front porch perfect for relaxing in the evenings, and a sense of privacy that I had never experienced in apartment living. Everything about my new home seemed perfect, except for one thing. Before signing the final papers, I was informed that the neighborhood had a homeowners association, HOA. I had heard horror stories about HOAs before, power-hungry board members, endless restrictions, and unreasonable fines, but I figured I could live with it. After all, how bad could it really be? I was about to find out just how much of a nightmare an HOA could become when the wrong person was in charge. When I first heard about the HOA, I had my reservations. I had always been the type of person who valued independence, and the thought of a group of people policing how I maintained my own home was unsettling. But I also understood that HOAs could have some benefits. They helped maintain property values, ensured that neighbors adhered to certain standards, and could even provide a sense of community. Still, I made sure to ask plenty of questions before finalizing my purchase. My real estate agent assured me that the HOA in this neighborhood was relatively mild compared to others. There were standard rules about lawn maintenance, noise levels, and home exteriors, but nothing too extreme. That was enough to ease my mind, at least for the time being. Once I moved in, I made an effort to be friendly with my neighbors and to familiarize myself with the community. I quickly learned that while most residents were easygoing, there was one person who seemed to run the show with an iron fist: Janet, the HOA president. My neighbors spoke about her in hushed tones, sharing stories of unreasonable demands and power trips. "Watch out for Janet," one of them warned. "She loves to enforce rules that don't even exist." I brushed off the warnings, thinking they were exaggerated. I was new to the neighborhood, and I figured it was best to keep an open mind. Little did I know, Janet was about to make my life miserable. Even before I met Janet in person, I had heard enough about her to know she wasn't someone to be taken lightly. Every neighborhood has that one person who seems to believe they are in charge of everything, and in our case, that person was Janet. She had been the HOA president for years, and from what I gathered, she ruled with an iron fist. The stories about her ranged from mildly annoying to downright absurd. One neighbor recounted how Janet had fined them for leaving their garbage cans out too long after trash pickup, even though they had retrieved them within the hour. Another told me about how she had forced a family to repaint their front door because the shade of blue they had chosen was too bright. There were even tales of her measuring grass height with a ruler to ensure lawns were kept within the HOA's strict guidelines. Despite these stories, I didn't think too much about it. I figured if I minded my own business and followed the basic neighborhood guidelines, I wouldn't have any problems. I was wrong. The first time I met Janet, I was outside watering my plants. It had been a few weeks since I moved in, and I was still getting my new home in order. The previous owner had neglected the yard, so I was in the process of planting new flowers, fixing up the fence, and generally making the space feel like my own. As I stood there with my watering can, I heard a sharp knock on my front door. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I hesitated for a moment before answering. When I opened the door, I was met with the sight of a middle-aged woman with short, perfectly styled hair, holding a clipboard and wearing an expression of forced politeness. "Hello there," she said in an overly cheerful tone that immediately set off alarm bells in my head. "I'm Janet, the HOA president. I'm here for a quick inspection of your property." I blinked in confusion. "Excuse me?" "Yes," she continued, glancing past me toward my backyard. "I need to check your garden, the fence, and a few other things to make sure everything is up to code. It's part of the HOA rules, you know." I immediately felt a surge of irritation. "I'm sorry, but I'm not actually part of the HOA," I said firmly. "I didn't sign up for that." Janet's expression darkened. "Well, you should be," she replied, her cheerful tone slipping into something more forceful. "But that doesn't really matter. HOA members are responsible for maintaining the community standards, and I have the right to inspect any property in the neighborhood." I folded my arms. "No, Janet. You don't. This is my property, and I'm asking you to leave." Her face flushed with a mix of disbelief and anger. "You can't just refuse an inspection. What do you think this is, some sort of free-for-all? You need to comply." "I don't have to do anything," I shot back. "And you don't have the authority to come onto my property without permission." Janet huffed, clicking her pen aggressively against her clipboard. "Well, we'll see about that. I'll be back, and you won't be getting away with this." With that, she spun on her heel and marched off, her high heels clacking loudly on the sidewalk. I watched her leave, a sinking feeling in my stomach. I had a strong suspicion that this was just the beginning. The next morning, I found a bright yellow violation notice taped to my front door. It was an official-looking document from the HOA, citing me for several infractions, including the placement of my new fence and the size of the plants I had put in my yard. The notice even listed potential fines for non-compliance. I read the notice twice, thinking maybe I had misunderstood something. Nope. It was exactly what I thought it was, Janet's attempt to exert control over me, despite the fact that I wasn't even part of the HOA. Frustrated, I took a picture of the notice and forwarded it to my lawyer, Carl. He responded quickly, reassuring me that this was just a scare tactic. "The HOA has no real authority over you," he said. "Janet is overstepping her bounds. Ignore the notice for now, and document everything." I followed his advice, but deep down, I knew this wasn't over. Janet had made it clear that she wasn't going to let this go, and I had no doubt that she would be back with more tricks up her sleeve. The battle had only just begun. Despite my firm stance, Janet's behavior intensified. She started driving by my house more frequently, slowing down as if inspecting my property. One day, while I was tending to my garden, I noticed her parked across the street, blatantly taking pictures of my yard with her phone. When I waved at her, she quickly turned away and sped off. It was clear she was looking for anything she could use against me. I knew I had to take action, so I called Carl again. He advised me to install a security camera to document any further harassment. That same day, I ordered a camera system and set it up in my backyard, ensuring I had concrete evidence if things escalated further. But even that didn't deter Janet. A few days later, I received another letter from the HOA, this time demanding that I attend a meeting to discuss my violations and address the state of my property. The letter even threatened legal action if I failed to comply. It was clear Janet wasn't backing down. I wasn't about to be intimidated, though. Instead of ignoring the letter, I responded with my own, clearly outlining that I was not part of the HOA and had no legal obligation to attend their meetings. I also included documentation of Janet's previous harassment, including photos of her taking pictures of my property. I sent the letter and waited for her response. I had drawn the line, but I knew this battle wasn't over yet. A week passed, and things seemed eerily quiet. No new letters, no unexpected visits from Janet, and no signs of her car slowing down in front of my house. I started to relax, thinking maybe she had finally given up. But that peace didn't last long. One morning, I stepped outside to water my plants and immediately noticed something was off. My backyard gate was wide open. My stomach dropped as I walked over to investigate. The lock had been cut. My heart pounded as I checked my yard, but nothing appeared to be missing. Still, the fact that someone had trespassed onto my property was unsettling. I knew exactly who was behind it. I immediately called Carl, who was furious but not surprised. He told me this was exactly the kind of evidence we needed to take legal action. Following his advice, I called the police and filed a formal report. The officer who arrived reviewed the security camera footage, which showed a shadowy figure near the gate in the middle of the night. There wasn't enough to prove it was Janet, but given her previous behavior, the officer suggested I take further security measures. I reinforced my locks, added more cameras, and prepared myself for whatever Janet would try next. Shortly after the break-in, I received another letter from the HOA, this time directly from Janet. She was demanding that I attend an emergency HOA board meeting to resolve the matter once and for all. It was clear she was desperate. But instead of ignoring the letter, I decided to take the fight to her. I gathered all my documentation, the violation notices, the letters, the photos, and the police report, and prepared for battle. The day of the meeting arrived, and I walked into the community center with confidence. Janet, already standing at the front, immediately launched into a speech about how my property was an eyesore and how I was disrupting the harmony of the neighborhood. She went on and on about how I needed to comply with the HOA's standards. But I wasn't about to let her control the narrative. When she finished, I calmly stood up, took out my documents, and addressed the board. "I am not part of this HOA, and I never agreed to follow its rules," I said, my voice firm. "Janet has been harassing me for weeks, trespassing on my property, and even attempting to intimidate me into compliance. I have already spoken with my lawyer and the police, and if this harassment continues, I will take legal action." The room fell silent. I could see Janet's face turning red with rage, but she had no response. I had the evidence, and I had the law on my side. Janet was seething. She had expected to intimidate me into compliance, but now she was the one on the defensive. "You have no idea what you're doing," she snapped. "You think you can just ignore the rules? You'll regret this." I met her glare without flinching. "I'm not ignoring anything," I replied. "I'm simply standing up for my rights. And if you continue this harassment, you'll be the one facing consequences." The murmurs in the room grew louder. The other board members exchanged glances, clearly realizing that Janet had overstepped her bounds. One of them, a man who had remained quiet throughout the meeting, finally spoke up. "Janet, I think we need to discuss this privately." Janet's face twisted with frustration, but she knew she had lost control of the situation. She stormed out of the meeting, muttering threats under her breath. I exhaled, feeling a weight lift off my shoulders. I knew Janet wasn't done with me yet, but for the first time, it felt like I had gained the upper hand. After the meeting, I expected Janet to retaliate, but for a few days, everything remained quiet. No new letters, no sudden HOA notices, and no unexpected visits. I almost started to believe that maybe, just maybe, she had backed off. But then I received a call from Carl. "I don't want to alarm you, but you need to come down to my office," he said. "There's been an update on your case." My stomach sank. I wasted no time getting to his office. When I arrived, he had a stack of documents laid out on his desk. "This is bigger than we thought," he said. "Janet has been using her position as HOA president to manipulate the board and pressure residents into complying with her demands. She's even been in talks with a local contractor about taking over property maintenance for the entire neighborhood. If she succeeds, she'll have even more control over everyone's homes, including yours." My jaw tightened. This wasn't just about my property anymore. Janet was trying to cement her power in the neighborhood, ensuring she could dictate everything. Carl looked at me seriously. "We have enough evidence to file a formal complaint. If we do this right, we can force her out of her position." I didn't hesitate. "Let's do it," I said. I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. I was fighting for everyone Janet had ever bullied. It was time to put an end to her reign of control. After being removed from her position, Janet didn't take her loss lightly. Instead of accepting the consequences of her actions, she doubled down on her vendetta against me. It started with subtle things, passive-aggressive notes left in my mailbox, my garbage bins mysteriously knocked over, and even a few odd complaints about my house being an eyesore. Then, things escalated. One evening, as I was arriving home from work, I noticed deep scratches on my car door. At first, I thought it might have been a random accident, but then I saw a familiar car parked down the street. Janet was sitting inside, glaring at me as I examined the damage. I immediately called the police to file a report, but without solid proof, there was little they could do. Still, I made sure to document everything, keeping records of every incident. I also made it a habit to check my security cameras daily. The footage showed Janet's car driving by my house multiple times at odd hours, but there was no direct evidence of her vandalizing my property. Frustrated but determined, I installed additional cameras with better angles and higher resolution. If Janet thought she could intimidate me into submission, she was in for a rude awakening. As Janet continued her petty harassment, I began to notice a shift in the neighborhood. My neighbors, who had once been neutral or even supportive of Janet's strict HOA rule enforcement, started expressing their frustrations. Many of them approached me, sharing their own horror stories of Janet's reign over the community. She had bullied elderly homeowners into unnecessary renovations, fined families for trivial infractions, and even forced one family to repaint their house twice because she didn't like the shade of blue they chose. People were fed up. The tide was turning, and I realized I wasn't the only one who wanted to see real change in the HOA. I decided to take advantage of the growing dissatisfaction. With Carl's help, I drafted a petition calling for an official review of Janet's actions and a full audit of the HOA's finances. If we could prove that Janet had been abusing her power beyond just petty violations, we could have her permanently barred from holding any HOA-related positions. I went door to door, explaining my case and sharing my evidence. To my surprise, almost every homeowner I spoke to was eager to sign. Some even offered their own testimonies about how Janet had wronged them over the years. It became clear that her removal from the presidency wasn't enough. Janet needed to be held accountable for her actions. With a petition full of signatures and a stack of documented complaints, Carl and I took our case to the HOA board. We formally requested an internal investigation into Janet's behavior and potential financial misconduct. The board members were hesitant at first, reluctant to turn against someone who had been such a dominant force in the HOA for years. But when we presented our evidence, including emails, witness statements, and financial discrepancies, they had no choice but to take action. A special hearing was scheduled, and Janet was required to attend. She arrived looking smug, as if she still believed she had the upper hand. But as the evidence was laid out piece by piece, her confidence began to crack. The board members questioned her about unauthorized fines, suspicious financial transactions, and her continued harassment of homeowners. She tried to deflect the accusations, claiming that she had only been enforcing the rules for the good of the community, but no one was buying it. Carl made a compelling argument that Janet's actions had not only violated ethical standards but could potentially be considered fraud. That caught everyone's attention. The board agreed to hire an independent auditor to review the HOA's finances, and in the meantime, they issued a restraining order against Janet, preventing her from interacting with HOA members or involving herself in community affairs. For the first time since this ordeal began, I felt like real justice was within reach. With her influence crumbling, Janet became desperate. Unable to operate within the HOA, she tried to rally support from a handful of loyal followers who still believed in her leadership. She spread rumors that I was the real problem, accusing me of trying to dismantle the HOA entirely and turn the neighborhood into a lawless mess. But her smear campaign failed miserably. The majority of residents had already seen through her manipulations, and her credibility was at an all-time low. That didn't stop her from trying one last bold move. One evening, I received an anonymous letter in my mailbox. The message was typed, but I recognized the tone instantly. It reeked of Janet's arrogance and entitlement. The letter threatened legal action against me for defamation and claimed that if I didn't drop my case, she would sue me for damages. It was an empty threat, and I knew it. Carl laughed when he read it, assuring me that Janet had no legal ground to stand on. Still, I wasn't about to let my guard down. If she was willing to go this far, I had to be ready for anything. I doubled down on security, ensuring that my cameras were in full working order and that my property was well protected. I also made sure to keep my neighbors in the loop, knowing that a united front would make it impossible for Janet to regain any foothold in the community. A few weeks after the hearing, the results of the financial audit came in. The findings were damning. Janet had been skimming money from HOA fees, overcharging homeowners for unnecessary violations, and directing funds to a contractor who just happened to be a close personal friend. It was outright corruption, and the board had no choice but to take immediate legal action. Janet was officially banned from any future involvement with the HOA, and the case was turned over to local authorities for further investigation. While she wasn't immediately arrested, she faced heavy fines and potential charges for fraud and embezzlement. Her once iron grip on the neighborhood had been shattered, and she was now nothing more than a disgraced former HOA president. The news spread quickly, and for the first time in a long time, the neighborhood felt lighter. Homeowners who had once been afraid to speak out against Janet were now openly celebrating her downfall. The HOA, now under new leadership, began working on rebuilding trust with the community, implementing fair policies, and ensuring that no single person would ever hold that much unchecked power again. As for me, I could finally enjoy my home in peace. I had fought back against a tyrant and won, proving that no one should have the power to bully and intimidate others without consequences. It had been a long, exhausting battle, but in the end, standing my ground had been worth it. And Janet? Well, she vanished from the neighborhood not long after. Last I heard, she was trying to sell her house, but with her tarnished reputation, finding a buyer willing to take on her baggage was proving to be quite the challenge. A fitting end for someone who had spent years making life miserable for everyone around her. As the dust settled after Janet's removal, I noticed a surprising shift in the neighborhood. People who had once avoided me, fearing retaliation from Janet, now started reaching out. Some stopped by my house to offer support, while others sent letters thanking me for standing up to her tyranny. I even learned that several residents had been silently enduring Janet's harassment for years, too intimidated to speak out. One elderly couple, the Walkers, shared how Janet had threatened to fine them for their flower bed, claiming it didn't match the community's aesthetic. Another neighbor, James, revealed that she had forced him to repaint his front door 3 times because she didn't like the shade he chose. It was clear that my battle with Janet wasn't just about me, it was about reclaiming the neighborhood from her oppressive rule. With the HOA now under new leadership, the new president, a reasonable and fair-minded woman named Linda, reached out to me personally. She assured me that the HOA would be reviewing and revising its policies to prevent abuse of power in the future. More importantly, she wanted to mend the relationship between the HOA and the residents. Linda even invited me to share my experience at a town hall meeting to discuss how the community could move forward together. At first, I was hesitant. I had no interest in being involved in HOA matters, but the more I listened to my neighbors' stories, the more I realized that they needed someone to advocate for them. If I could help prevent another Janet from taking over, then perhaps everything I had endured would be worth it. I agreed to attend the meeting, determined to ensure that the HOA would never again be used as a tool for control and intimidation. Despite losing her position, Janet was not ready to accept defeat quietly. A few weeks after her removal, rumors started circulating that she was planning to sue me for defamation. She claimed that my accusations had ruined her reputation and cost her the respect of the community. At first, I dismissed the rumors, assuming they were just the desperate words of a bitter woman. But then, I received a letter from her lawyer. The letter was filled with baseless claims, accusing me of slander and demanding a formal apology. It even hinted at a possible lawsuit if I did not comply. Rather than panicking, I contacted Carl, my ever-reliable attorney, who assured me that Janet had no legal standing. Everything I had said about her was backed by evidence, and if anything, she was the one guilty of harassment and trespassing. Carl drafted a firm response, rejecting her demands and warning her that if she continued with this baseless legal pursuit, we would countersue for harassment and emotional distress. I had expected Janet to push forward, determined to make my life miserable, but surprisingly, she backed down. Perhaps she finally realized that she had no power over me anymore. With Janet's threats neutralized, I could finally focus on the positive changes happening in the neighborhood. The town hall meeting was just around the corner, and I was preparing to address the residents about the future of the community. On the night of the town hall meeting, I walked into the community center feeling a mix of nervousness and determination. The room was filled with people, more than I had expected. I spotted familiar faces, neighbors who had once lived in fear of Janet's wrath, now looking hopeful for change. Linda opened the meeting by addressing the elephant in the room, the need to rebuild trust between the HOA and the residents. She acknowledged the abuses of power that had taken place under Janet's rule and assured everyone that the new leadership was committed to fairness and transparency. Then, it was my turn to speak. I took a deep breath and stepped forward. I recounted my experiences, from Janet's first visit to my property to her relentless harassment and eventual downfall. I also highlighted the importance of knowing one's rights as a homeowner and not allowing an overzealous HOA to dictate every aspect of life. To my surprise, my speech was met with applause. People shared their own stories, and for the first time, the community felt united in a way that hadn't been possible under Janet's rule. Linda proposed new HOA regulations that would prevent any one individual from having unchecked power, and the board agreed to put them to a vote. By the end of the meeting, it was clear that real change was happening. The HOA was no longer a tool for one person's power trip, but a genuine organization meant to support and improve the neighborhood. As I left the meeting, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. This battle had been exhausting, But in the end, it had been worth it. With Janet officially out of the picture and the HOA moving in a better direction, I finally felt at peace in my home. The changes in the community were noticeable. People were more open, friendlier, and less fearful. No one was afraid of receiving arbitrary violation notices or surprise inspections anymore. I continued working on my garden without any interference, transforming my yard into the peaceful sanctuary I had always envisioned. Neighbors even started stopping by to chat, something that had been unheard of when Janet was in power. For the first time since moving in, I truly felt at home. Carl and I stayed in touch, and he remained vigilant, just in case Janet attempted another stunt. But months passed, and she seemed to have disappeared from the neighborhood altogether. Whether she moved away or simply chose to lay low, I didn't care. I was just happy to finally live my life without her looming over me. The new HOA leadership honored their promises, implementing new policies that ensured no president could act as a dictator again. The board also established a homeowners' rights committee, giving residents a direct voice in HOA matters. It was a level of fairness and transparency that had been sorely missing before. Looking back on everything that had happened, I realized that this experience had taught me some valuable lessons. First, it reinforced the importance of knowing your rights as a homeowner. If I hadn't stood my ground and sought legal help, Janet would have continued to bully and intimidate me. Knowledge truly is power, and being informed about my rights was what ultimately protected me. Second, it showed me the power of community. Initially, I had felt like I was fighting this battle alone, but in reality, many of my neighbors were just as fed up with Janet as I was. Once they saw someone standing up to her, they found the courage to speak out too. Sometimes, all it takes is one person to start the momentum for change. Finally, I learned that even the most challenging situations can lead to something good. If Janet hadn't targeted me, I never would have taken action against the HOA's abuse of power. Her downfall led to a better, fairer system that benefited everyone in the neighborhood. As I sat in my backyard, enjoying the peaceful atmosphere I had worked so hard to create, I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of satisfaction. I had faced a Karen, endured her worst, and come out victorious. But more importantly, I had helped make a lasting change for my community. And as for Janet, well, wherever she was, I had a feeling she was still fuming over her defeat. But that was no longer my problem. I had won my battle, and I was finally free to enjoy the home I had fought so hard for.